Last Lord's Day, in anticipation of today, a special day, I talked about the trial of Jesus. We looked at the details of his arrest, the proceedings during the night and what happened the next day, the injustice of it all. So I'll not spend a great deal of time on that today. Rather, I would like for us to move on and look at some of the other things that occurred there in that last week of Jesus' life. I mentioned, I think, last week that according to the stories, we have more information about the last days of Jesus than of any other famous personage, any other personage in all of antiquity. And that is, in fact, what we find. We find details that are corroborated even outside of Christian circles. For example, we find writings in secular literature that support the crucifixion. I was just looking at an article this morning that kind of infuriated me. I'll be honest. I was not expecting to find this in the source where I was perusing. And the author tried to say that the evangelist just made up the whole idea of the crucifixion. Now, you would expect that among some village atheist who's never actually studied a whole lot and looked into the matter. But this guy purported to be some sort of scholar. Seemed to have had some kind of educated background in this area, but he was completely wrong. He knew better. The information is out there. It's available. So we do support the fact of Jesus' death, his crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. That's not just because the Gospels say so. That would be enough. That would be enough, of course. These are very good historical records. But because we have sufficient support from other sources. So there really is no doubt among most right-thinking people that Jesus was in fact tortured under the Jews and the Romans in about AD 33 of this era, the Christian era. I want us to discuss that this morning and to move on and notice some of the things that are taught in the Bible concerning that. And we will do that just as soon as this device begins to click. But it's not doing so far. I think the batteries may be dead. I'm not sure. That did it. Hit move. Thank you. As you can see, our subject is one that coincides with that national thought, as mentioned ably in prayer a while ago. We say this, it's an obligatory disclaimer. We do not celebrate Easter in the way the secular world or the religious world does. The secular world does respect it, as Chris mentioned in his prayer. Every first day of the week is the day we honor the resurrection of our Lord. And yet we're thankful that it is going on in our culture. And I thought it was an appropriate thing for us at this time of the year to consider this subject matter because it is on people's minds. I want us to talk about the triumph of Christ over the tomb. And as I indicated last time, we started looking at the trial. And that's groundwork. That's basic for us to understand what happened in the crucifixion. This time we'll notice something about the crucifixion. But I'll be honest, I'm not planning to spend a great deal of time. We only have 15 minutes. But a little bit just talking about the torture of Jesus. And then we'll move on and speak of the tomb itself. Some of these items are really appropriate, really helpful in terms of a Christian defense. A defense of our faith. The time element matters, and we'll spend a little bit on that. And then, of course, we'll look at the actual resurrection, the triumph of Jesus of Nazareth over the tomb, and then the testimony that continues to this day, especially in written form, the testimony by those who were eyewitnesses and who saw him alive after his death, after his crucifixion and burial. And then we'll just mention briefly, because of the time factor, a couple of things about his transport from this earth into the heavenly realms. That is, we call that the ascension. That's not in the last week of Jesus' life, but it is in the waning days of his time or his sojourn here upon the earth. When we speak of his last week, we're thinking about his last week in the flesh, corrupt flesh as we now have. And then, of course, there were at least 40 days beyond that period of time. Let's look a little bit briefly at the crucifixion. We know it coincides, the biblical narrative, with what we have learned elsewhere about the Roman practice. The Romans were not the only ancient peoples to practice this form of execution, but they had perfected it to a fine, cruel art in their time. The Jews seemingly also, strangely enough, had practiced it in some phases of their history back in the period prior to the beginning of the Christian era, we would say, but it was a rare thing. And of course, it's horrible to even contemplate. We don't have to spell it all out. We hear this kind of stuff and read it a lot, and the record reveals the details amply for us to know just how painful it was and how shameful it was for Jesus to be attached to that old Roman cross. Nails piercing his hands and his feet, hanging there, not being able to breathe. We've heard about the medical phenomena that's involved, the asphyxiation that often kills the victims, loss of blood. Many times that's it, death from shock itself because of the tremendous pain. Normally, they would break the bones of the victims in order to ensure their death, and this was what was going to occur even on this day. The Jews had requested it of the Roman executioners. Now, they had instigated the execution, but they wanted to make sure it was over and done with by the end of the day of preparation, which corresponds to our Friday. So the crucifixion did take place on what we call Friday, and they wanted it before sundown. They wanted the death to take place and the bodies to be removed because it would have been a sacrilegious thing to have these corpses hanging there in public view on this sacred time that would begin at sundown for the Jews. When they came to Jesus, he was already dead. He had died quicker than most thought he would. So one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and forthwith came there blood and water. Now we know those details, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on that. But we stop to say, not only is it corroborated by history, as I was speaking about in the introduction, but the meaning is profound. And the temptation is to elaborate. The meaning is this: sin is so terrible. Our rebellion against our Creator. We can't fix it on our own. No matter how many good deeds we do after the fact, those good deeds will not in any way outweigh anyone's sin. Sin demands death. Somebody has to die. As a rule, it's going to be the one that commits the sin, and that's just, right? That's just. But there's something other than justice in God's character. There's mercy. So he provided this plan. He allowed his only Son to die in my stead, in your stead, so that if we are in him, if we are faithful followers of him, then the merits of his death, his suffering, accrue to us. They come to us. And God forgives us despite our wrongdoing. Now, again, it would take sermon upon sermon really to try to milk that of its meaning. So we're not going to do that. But we want to mention the torture. And that has to do with the crucifixion of Christ. And then, of course, we move on to look at the tomb itself. And here we are confronted with some facts that matter. As we said, the Romans wanted to make sure that this had happened to please the Jews because they did not want these bodies on the crosses after sundown. Here it was Friday, a period of time just prior to the beginning of the Jewish Passover, a most sacred holiday. Pilate was able to grant the body of Jesus to one of the members of the Sanhedrin, the highest court of the Jews, Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph had been a secret disciple, no doubt for fear of the Jews. It was not a popular thing to be. But here, when the time limit was so pressed, something had to be done with the body. And when Joseph realized, if we let the Romans take it, this would normally be their responsibility. They executed him. They're going to take these three bodies from down these crosses and throw them probably into a common pit. Common criminals would be buried there. He didn't want that to happen. He went to Pilate. Went out on a limb, as it were. And Pilate was reasonable enough to grant the request. Joseph knew that he had a garden filled with tombs. And there was a new tomb there, just hewn out. No man had ever been laid in that tomb before. So it was a pure, clean tomb. And we can identify this tomb then as one from actually this man himself, Joseph of Arimathea. We'll move on and look at those points here. And notice it was known. Now, why do I say that? There are liberals today who write about the subject, who allege that Christ, his body must have been thrown in a common grave. This was what would be expected. And that is, of course, the point of the narratives. That was the expected thing. And the narratives show us the surprising thing that happened. We can identify the place of his burial as the actual tomb of Joseph. Some have said, well, Joseph is a legendary figure. He was written into the record after the fact. That's the way the Christians started telling it. But they started telling it so soon thereafter, so soon after the events. They couldn't have gotten away with fabricating a figure like Joseph, saying that this prominent jurist, this member of the highest court of the Jews, whose name would have been well known, fact-checking could have been easily done at the time they were presenting this, that he had been the one to take the body, and the body was placed in his tomb. Unless we can accept that this is just straightforward history, it would be very difficult to understand how that was ever a part of the story told. Well, the simplest way to understand it is because it was actually what occurred. So we know then the identification of this tomb. It was a garden tomb near the place of crucifixion itself. And it matters to think about that. Now, Nicodemus was another member of the high court. Remember, he was the one who was a secret disciple. He came to Jesus by night and had the exchange about the new birth in John chapter 3. He also was an honorable counselor who assisted Joseph in the burial. They actually provided over 100 pounds of spices to wrap the body of Jesus in deference to their Lord. He was buried then in that tomb in the garden near Calvary. And here we have what we could call the purification. It's natural purification because no contamination had yet entered into the tomb. And this is what we have in prophecy in Psalm chapter 16 and verse 10, that he would not see corruption. His body would not see corruption, not from itself, not from putrefaction itself, nor from touching that of other dead bodies. He was buried with the rich, according to Isaiah 53 and verse 9. Again, a minor detail way back in the Old Testament, but here it finds correspondence in this episode of the burial in the tomb of Joseph. We have a description then of it being a tomb that we might call an acrosalia tomb, a bench tomb that would have it would be a cave carved out of the rock, and there was a place to put the bodies. Now, this might seem a small thing to some. Suppose the record said after his death, his body was placed upon a funeral pyre, it was set afire, and then the ashes were put into an urn and kept in a very sacred place. Had the record said that, we might raise an eyebrow. That was not the burial custom of the Jews. Suppose the record had said after his death, his body was taken down and it was placed 6 feet under the ground in a wooden coffin, buried there, and there was a tombstone marking the place. That won't fit either. That's our custom. That's not what the Jews did. But the record tells us that there was a tomb that was carved out of the stone, and to close the entrance to the tomb, there was a large circular type rock that was rolled into place, a big heavy stone. Now this matters. This is the detail found in the book. It's sort of incidental. But when we go back and archaeologically we excavate and dig into that area, that very part of the world, in that very time period, the layers correspond to that very time period. This is exactly the kind of tomb that we find and nothing else. A small detail, but just one more incidental that corroborates the historicity of the record. He was placed then in the tomb, and the stone, of course, was put there in front of it. So we'll say there was purification from the fact of it naturally being a new tomb. We have just looked at the description of it, and then we'll talk about the fortification. Not only the stone was placed there, after the Sabbath was over that evening, the next evening, late in the evening, on the holy day of the Jews, the Jewish authorities went to Pilate and they asked for a guard because they feared the disciples might come and try to steal away the body in order to maintain the idea that they would have thought of it as a lie, that he would be resurrected from the dead, because while he was alive, he had made that prediction. And they were aware of it. They were aware of just about everything he said because a meticulous record had been kept and much information had been passed from person to person about what he said. So they knew that this was a possibility. And the guard was placed there. Again, part of the fortification. And then the tomb was sealed. This was an official seal. So we see that it was not something left easily for grave robbers. At the same time, we might notice the incidental detail that women, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of Joseph, and then from other records in the Gospels, it appears also Joanna and Susanna, who were part of Herod's kingdom, part of Herod's court, they also, these prominent women, viewed the place where he was buried. They had seen where the tomb was located. That datum also matters a great deal, because in a couple of days, after the third day, literally, he will be raised up. And there will be no loss of the tomb, no forgetting where it was in that short time period. They saw it and knew exactly where the tomb was located. So then we have the chief priests, as I mentioned, who brought in the guards. The thing we have to notice about the guards is it didn't work. He escaped anyway. Now this is an embarrassing detail to make up out of whole cloth. Why would this have been made up? Why would the Jews have done this and then told on themselves, we put a guard there, but it didn't work out. They were unsuccessful. Unless it happened exactly like it is related in the book of Matthew. And that makes more sense. Just to see it as straightforward history, then we can understand the guard makes perfect sense. So we move on then from the tomb. And we notice, of course, that what we will find in a moment, and this coincides also with the next point, is a great triumph and in some way a deliverance of that body out of the tomb, an emptying of the tomb on the third day. This is the evacuation of the tomb. How did it happen? There's the question. Now the next thing we'll look at is the time element. The time of the crucifixion has been in debate. Again, this rather supercilious smart aleck I was reading this morning on the internet tried to maintain that all scholars know there's a discrepancy here. John tells us that it took place in a period of time prior to the at the 6th hour, and we're told by Mark that it took place at the 6th hour, rather the 3rd hour and then the 6th hour respectively. And there's a contradiction, because you have, according to Mark's account, you have Pilate, in fact, actually still talking to Jesus when, according to the other gospel, Jesus was being crucified. How do you reconcile this discrepancy? Simple. John is using the Roman method of reckoning, the Roman chronology. The Roman day began at dawn, or midnight rather, and the Jewish day began at the close of the day. So the next day happened after 6 o'clock, or basically the time of the setting of the sun. So we have then that difference, and it perfectly accounts for the two different times that are mentioned. Then we have the time while he was in the tomb. How long was he actually there? 3 days. Well, he was there in a part of 3 days. He was there Friday, part of Friday afternoon, Friday evening. He was there all day Saturday. This is the way we reckon time. And then he was there early on Sunday morning before the resurrection. So the Jews would have counted any part of a day as a day. So he was there, therefore, for 3 days. The time of the resurrection was on the first day of the week. The actual resurrection and triumph from the tomb occurred there on what we would call today Sunday. And then there's the question of the time of the women's visit. In the gospel accounts, we have statements made to the fact that they were on their way to visit the tomb early in the morning prior to daylight. Another reference might say just as it began to dawn. There's no discrepancy there. It takes time to get from their house, especially if it was over in Bethany, a few kilometers away. It takes time to get from Bethany over to the tomb area where he was buried outside the city walls. And when they left, it was no doubt completely dark just prior to the beginning of the dawn. And by the time they got there, it was starting to dawn. So those things, there's no discrepancy there, no problem with any of the time elements. And then, of course, the greatest of all events in human history. And there's no way to do justice to this subject in the short time we have. No way. But it was the triumph of this man in history, the first in history, over the tomb in a way that had never occurred before. And will never happen again until the end of the world. Now somebody says, wait, I read that Jesus himself raised from the dead Lazarus and other people like that. That is true. And this is what we could call instances of resuscitation. And that's a technical term, not like you would use among EMTs today, among medical personnel, not to resuscitate somebody who's just unconscious. But it would mean to bring somebody back from the dead, but back in the same body, the same old body. Nothing changed about that body when it's revivified. However, resurrection is a technical concept that means that body is made alive again and the body itself changes. It's glorified. It becomes something completely different from what it was. And yet there's still some continuity. We do not fully comprehend it, but we know Christ was the first fruits. And by his coming forth in that way from the tomb to be transformed, he is a guarantee. This historical matter, one day it will happen to us also at the end of time. On that final day, we too will be raised from the dead. We could look at some of the matters such as the persons who came to view this. We have, of course, Mary Magdalene, who was coming according to John's gospel. And she tried to look into the tomb, but before she got there, wondering who would move the stone back, this wonderful thing happened. We cannot really comprehend it. We have to just look at the verbal descriptions in the Gospels. An angel had come down from heaven. There was a great earthquake that accompanied that phenomenon. He moved the stone, not to let the body of Jesus get out. He moved the stone in order for the witness to be able to peer in. Jesus had been resurrected. And apparently his body was able to leave the tomb without the removal of the stone itself. So now the stone is removed, and then he sits upon the stone. And of course the guards who are there are affrighted. They faint, they swoon, and then they run back to tell the authorities. And remember the story that was given when they told the authorities. It's hard for us to imagine this. Rather than the authorities saying, "This is wonderful. We were wrong about this man." Rather than doing that, they doubled down in their evil deed. They doubled down and said, all right, we'll protect you. They gave them money to do this. We'll bribe you. You take this money and you say that while we were asleep, the disciples came and stole the body. And that lie was repeated even in the early days of the Christian movement, according to Matthew, even unto the day when he wrote his gospel. So we have then this triumph. And it occurred under these unusual events. We could look at all the details, but time fails us. So we move on and we talk about then what had occurred after this event. One more thing we will say. When I mention here the philosophical possibility of this occurring, now this is not a philosophy study. But philosophy gets in the way. And all of us have a philosophy. And everybody we know has a philosophy of some kind or another. Many of our contemporaries have a very materialistic philosophy. And according to the strict logic of materialism, philosophical naturalism, miracles cannot happen. Suspensions of the laws of nature, that just cannot happen in the nature of the case. And that makes sense. It's a fair deduction from the starting point that all there is nature and natural laws. These laws remain. They do not change. Miracles such as a dead body coming back to life do not happen under the atheist regime. That's true. We're not locked into atheism or materialism. We have studied many times before reasons for accepting the existence of Almighty God, our Creator. And if God made the world, it's a simple matter for Him to raise a dead body, to bring him back to life. That's a simple matter. So there are no philosophical reasons that really impinge on this that would in any way refute the issues that are set forth. We have historical evidences. We've talked about the empty tomb as history in the past. And most importantly of all, the testimony we'll look at again briefly in some detail. We see the doctrinal significance of all this is the same really as the doctrinal significance of the crucifixion. Those two things go hand in hand. In Romans chapter 1 and verse 4, we know that he was shown to be the Son of God by the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection from the dead. In Romans chapter 4 and verse 25, it is said that he was condemned or crucified for our justification. He was raised for our justification. He was delivered and raised. Those two things are held together. The delivery, that is his crucifixion, and the resurrection. And they're part of the same whole cloth of what Jesus did for us. Glorification means that when we die, we will be as He is. The testimony, I wish we had time to deal with this. If you were making up the story, you certainly wouldn't have said the women were the first there. But the record does say the women were the first there. Why would you not make it up? Because sadly, women didn't have such a legal status in that day, in that culture. Their testimony was not considered worthwhile in a courtroom. So if you're going to make up witnesses, you would send these men there, you see. But it was not made up. It happened just like the record said, and that's why they're included as the earliest witnesses. Then, of course, we have the disciples, especially Peter and John, who peered into the tomb. Later on, Christ would appear to Saul of Tarsus. We know him as the Apostle Paul. The testimony is sure from people who had every way to know that it occurred and had every reason to tell the truth about it. Those who were willing to go to martyrdom for this story, this report. And then, of course, you have the final transport back into heaven, his ascension. He's at the right hand of God. He will one day return in the clouds. So we've looked at these matters. We looked last week at his trial. We've noticed his crucifixion and his burial. We've talked about the resurrection, the testimony about it, and then his ascension. All this comes down to a very practical point for those who need to become New Testament Christians. There is no power, no efficacy for salvation in the water in the baptistry. No power at all in the water. But there is power in the act of baptism. According to 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 21, that power is not from the water elements. That power is from the resurrection of Jesus. And this is why Paul could say in Romans chapter 6 verses 3 to 5, we are buried with him by baptism into death. We studied his death. We know some details about it. So that we are buried with him just as Christ was buried. Part of the gospel plan. The death, burial, and resurrection. And then we are raised with him to walk in newness of life. Spiritually, just as Jesus walked in newness of life and was given a new body that did not have exactly the same characteristics of that old corruptible body that had perished in the tomb, but had been transformed into a body still with flesh and bones, Luke chapter 24 and verse 39, but a body that would live forever and never go away. And we too have the hope of receiving that body one day. This morning, if you need to obey the gospel as we've just discussed, let your faith send you to repentance and confession, and then water baptism as per the commandment of Christ our Savior himself, Matthew 28 verses 18 to 20, to live a faithful life before him, so that if he does not return in our lives, but we must perish as all men do, and we're buried, that one day we too will come forth from our tombs, triumphant, just as Christ did. Whatever you need to do, let us know about what together we stand and sing.